let's get into it. You are a financial manager with a company called Portafone. What does Portafone do? They make cell phones, and today cell phones more or less means smartphones, because most people have smartphones rather than the older type of cell phone. Okay, now you might say to yourself, what do I know about the smartphone market? I don't know anything about this industry. Well, you do actually. Just by looking around you, you can observe the fact that most people have a smartphone. Okay, who doesn't have a smartphone? It's about 66% of the entire world has one. In a country like the UK, it's at about 90% saturation. Okay, so we're looking at a highly saturated market. And what do we know about a highly saturated market? Well, without doing any special analysis at all, it stands to reason that if the market is very saturated, then the growth is going to be very low. Because if everyone's got a thing, then not everyone is buying the thing, okay? So that's low growth. Okay, so that's a couple of things we know about the smartphone market straight away. And in a low growth market, this market is growing about 1.5% annually, so that's quite slow. In a slow growth market, in a saturated market, we've got intense competition because market share gains are very hard to win. You've got to come up with something very, very special in order to convince someone to buy your mobile phone instead of the other one. Okay, so we know we've got high competitive rivalry, and you know just from looking around you that there's all kinds of different brands of smartphone. You might have an iPhone from Apple, you might have a Samsung Galaxy, you might have a Sony, you might have some Google phone, you might have an LG. There's all kinds, and that tells us something else. It means that we have a high threat of substitution. Okay, so let's just run down that. Highly saturated, low growth, intense competition, high threat of substitution. High threat of substitution because let's just look at it. If you swap your iPhone out for a Samsung, you're not suddenly unable to make a phone call on it. You're not suddenly unable to use a camera. All the phones, whatever brand you buy, they've all got the same things on them. There's no great difference in utility. There's no difference at all in utility between any of them. You can switch them out very easily. Okay, and so here are the things we know about that type of market. Using a model like Porter's 5 forces, we can say that in a market where we've got high competitive rivalry and a high threat of substitution, then we've got low profitability. Okay, because the model tells us that when the forces are high, profitability in that market is low. So we know right from the get-go, just from looking at one word, we know, and looking around us, we know that we've got an industry that has low growth, high competition, a low profitability, with a high threat of substitution, which makes it a very tough market. Okay, now that is market intelligence that you can take to the bank on exam day, because here's the key about the MCS exam. You will be expected to answer questions as though you really are the financial manager with Portafone. And if you really are the financial manager with Portafone, then you know about the industry. You've got industry knowledge because you work in it. Okay, so you're expected to have that industry knowledge and apply it. The other thing to note is that there's no marks in the exam for trotting out a model like Porter's 5 forces and showing that you've learned it. The marks come from showing that you can use it and apply it in an industry context to help you make decisions about the market. Okay, that's right from the start, and we've got all of that from one word. Okay, let's move on. Let's pick another word. Okay, so we can see here that you're the financial manager and you report to a senior financial manager, and that person reports to the finance director. Now, the finance director is operating at the strategic level of management. So this person, whoever it is deciding strategy. You, on the other hand, are a financial manager. Your job is not to decide strategy, but to put strategies into action. That's what you're doing. Okay, so now looking down here, it says your primary responsibilities are associated with management accounting. So that's where you're operating, and management accounting It's all about making reports that enable strategic decisions. You're going to be looking internally at the company and actually reporting up to your superiors to enable them to make strategic decisions. That's the job. Now, how is the examiner going to use this? Well, you might be faced with a situation where you have to consider something like a human resources issue. It says here that you have to liaise with all kinds of departments. Let's just pick human resources as an example. Human resources is all about talent and people. Okay, so what sort of issues might human resources be faced with in the market that we've just examined? Well, it's a high-tech market, and so you are going to need people that are highly skilled in science-based professions. You're going to need people that can write software to run your operating systems. You're going to need people that know the difference between one type of LCD screen and another. You're going to need people that can design printed circuit boards, source components, put things together. You're going to need people that can design cases that are light but look good. This is highly skilled work. That provides significant competitive advantage, so there's going to be a lot of competition for that talent. And as we already know from our Porter's 5 forces, we've got a very highly competitive, saturated market, so there's going to be intense competition for the right people. How do you find these people? How do you retain these people? How do you stop them leaving Portafone and going to work for Samsung, for example? Okay, so that's the sort of thing that Human Resources Department might be concerned with. Portafone, it says, encourages managers to engage with the wider community. Now, why are we being told this? I think this is a question about stakeholders. I suspect the examiner wants us to look at the notion of stakeholders within this industry. Who are the main stakeholders in the smartphone industry? Well, the end users are stakeholders because they are the people who are actually going to pay for these phones and use them. But in actual fact, in this particular industry, the main customers of a cell phone maker like Portafone are the networks, the people like O2, Orange, AT&T, the people that are actually carrying the signal from one place to another. These are the people that actually buy the phones in bulk and sell them on, resell them, often at a discount to the end user. So these are very important customers, very important stakeholders that have a lot of power. Now, using Mendelow's matrix, you know that you can start mapping out stakeholders according to the kind of power and influence that they have. I mean, let's just do it with those that we've brought up, okay? Let's have a look at the employees. The employees are stakeholders, and often when you map employee power on Mendelow's, we see them as low power, high interest stakeholders. But actually in this industry, where there's such intense competition for highly skilled work, employees actually have a lot of power. Okay, so that brings you back to the human resources issue. Okay, so if we've got something that comes up where employees might not be happy, then you've got an issue, haven't you, where you've got to think about how to satisfy them. Okay, so high power stakeholders, they need to be kept close. We know this from Mendelow's. Okay, so I think that the reason we're being told this is the examiner wants us to take Mendelow's and use it to map out the stakeholders in this particular industry and consider the power that each of them have, and then bring that knowledge to the exam to answer questions and show that you've applied it. I think that's probably why we're being told this. Okay, so don't be surprised if in the exam some sort of question comes up where, for some reason or other, you will have to bring out your Mendelow's matrix and start mapping stakeholders and using that information, applying that knowledge to the situation in question. Okay, something that often comes up in exams. Mendelow's is regularly examined in that way. You need to apply it. Alright, so let's move on. Here it says that as part of this sort of outreach program, you're providing teaching support to the Faculty of Business at the local university. Okay, now why are we being told this? I suspect that the examiner wants us to consider what we might get out of that relationship as Portafone. Okay, now for one thing, as we've been looking at human resources and the difficulty in attracting skilled talent, then this relationship might give Portafone early access to talent, because you're in there engaging with students who are going to become the graduates that you need to recruit into your company. So that's one thing that they might get out of it. But there's also another benefit that they might get out of it, and this brings us right back to what we looked at earlier with this highly saturated, intensely competitive market. And that's that it might give Portafone access to high quality R&D research and development. So we're looking at a university, you've got some of the brightest sparks in the country working as research fellows here or something. Perhaps Portafone can part fund a program of research, and then you would get the benefit of the findings as you get access to laboratories and very smart people. That helps you to gain a competitive advantage. That might be the sort of thing the examiner wants us to have a look at. Okay, now let's move on to the last thing that I want to pick out of this particular page, and that is this notion of the student who's doing the report, and it says here they were asked to sign a non-disclosure agreement. Okay, now that's quite a normal thing, but the fact that we're being told this, we've not got very much information here. There's only 3 paragraphs, and the fact that that's been put in there is a bit of a signal that we need to think about why. What might happen, for example, if that student was to accidentally leave their USB memory stick on a train, and your incredible innovations that they've had access to suddenly fall into the public domain, and suddenly Apple now has access to your competitive strategy or your new innovation. Okay, what happens then? Well, I suppose you could take legal action against that poor student for breaching the non-disclosure agreement, but I'm not sure that would be a massive help. Students don't have an awful lot of money, so they can't compensate you for any lost revenue. But the other thing is that if you were to take legal action against a student, you may have issues with some of your stakeholders, particularly the end users might not like this. It might affect negatively on your reputation, your standing in the community, and that might affect the networks. If there's negative publicity around Portafone for doing something a bit mean like that, then it might affect whether the networks want to buy from you as opposed to Samsung or someone else. So you've got to think about that. That's important. But the other aspect of this, and probably something that's probably more likely to be of interest in the exam, is the issue of patents, because intellectual property, that's your innovation, that's your competitive advantage, is likely to be protected by patents, and patents stop your competitors from using your special process or knowledge that you've developed in order to compete with you. So what happens, for example, if you've got this special new touchscreen technology that's way ahead of what the iPhone even is doing, and suddenly Apple gets this and starts using that technology for their phones? You can, of course, you can take legal action against Apple for breach of patents, but these things cost an awful lot of money, and that's when you would need to liaise with the Treasury that control the assets and the cash of your company, and see whether this is something that you want to invest your money in. Legal action costs a fortune, and you might not win it. Okay, so now we're down to the issue of risk analysis. What is the risk of Apple or Samsung getting your technology versus the risk of spending too much on legal action versus the risk of not spending the money on the legal action? You've got to balance these things together and work out where the greater risk is and where you're going to spend the most money. If you've got limited cash resources, do you want to put all your money into paying lawyers on something that might not come out, or should you spend your money elsewhere? What if you haven't got enough money? Should you raise finance? Should you sell more shares? Or is it more expedient to get some debt financing, get another loan from the banks? It might be easier to get hold and quicker to get hold of that money, but then you've not only got to pay back that debt, but you've got interest payments that now form part of the expenses that you have to find cover for in your cash flows. Okay, so all of these things tie together. Can you see how it's a network of different things? There's a chain reaction. If this happens, then what happens next? And then what does that mean for this department, the other department, and everyone else? How are the stakeholders going to react to any of these stages in the reaction? That's the way you've got to start thinking. All right, let's move on to page 2. Here we are on page 2 then, and right from the start we've got an absolute hornet's nest of intrigue here, because it says Portafone designs and manufactures mobile phones. Now this is an important distinction, because one of their key rivals, Apple, design only. They don't have any manufacturing facilities. They design these phones in Cupertino in California in the US, and they send those designs over to China, where the phones are actually built by a company called Foxconn, a contract manufacturer, and Foxconn is the one that actually goes out and sources the components and brings them in and assembles them together and makes these iPhones, puts them all together, puts them in a box and gets them ready to be shipped. Apple is a design-only company when it comes to cell phones, and that makes them asset light. Okay, Portafone, on the other hand, has significant assets because they've got fabrication plants, factories, assembly lines. They've got machines that can do the special tasks that are needed to make these mobile phones, put them together. Okay, and so Portafone is a bit more like a company like Samsung, because Samsung manufactures, and Samsung, I'll let you into a little industry secret. Samsung not only manufactures phones, but they manufacture the components that go in everyone else's phones. So they actually make the components that go inside an iPhone. Now that's some interesting knowledge, because Portafone could get into the components business. The way Samsung does it is they start making the component before they even start making the phone, before they enter that product category, which means that all the people that are established there now are sourcing their components from Samsung, which gives Samsung an awful lot of supplier power. They can raise prices and create a massive barrier to entry. Okay, so when they start making their phones, they've already got vertically access to these components, the inputs, got access, whereas they can start limiting access for the other rivals, which puts them in a very strong competitive position. So can you see we're back to Porter's 5 forces here? How can Portafone increase its supplier power, for instance? It could enter the components business and start supplying its rivals in the way that Samsung does. That gives it a significant competitive advantage. And of course we know that in a market that's as saturated as this one, any competitive advantage you can possibly get is going to help. So that's just one aspect of it, but of course where you've got factories and production lines and property, you've got all kinds of issues around, should you own these or should you lease them? Can you sell them and raise finance, or can you use them as collateral to raise debt finance? There's all that kind of question around the issue of raising finance. But also, where you've got factories, plants, property, you start to raise a lot of operational questions, okay, about things like, for example, capacity. Have you got enough capacity? If you don't have enough capacity, you can't meet demand, and so you miss sales. But if you've got too much capacity, then you've got inventory sitting around doing nothing. So we might be into the issue of demand forecasting. Apple, for example, uses demand forecasting at an early stage to try and predict the level of demand they're going to have in any given market, and then that informs a level of manufacture that Foxconn is doing for them out in China before it even ever gets shipped out. Okay, so that's something that you might want to think about. But if you've got a lot of inventory sitting around in warehouses and it isn't earning money, so you might need to do a little bit of analysis of the balance sheet here and see how long it's taking Portafone to convert inputs into cash, and see if there aren't efficiencies that can be gained in the production process, and it may well be that outsourcing certain processes is going to be the answer to gaining efficiencies. They might want to move to just-in-time manufacturing, and so all these questions go together. Okay, and if it was to change the way that it manufactured, for example, if it was to outsource, then what are the implications for human resources, for the employees, those high power stakeholders? Okay, so now you can see how something here can impact some things we've already looked at, and so that everything is connected. All right, that's why I called it a hornet's nest, because a lot of issues are actually hidden within it. All right, so let's move on. The company is based in Farland, okay, and Farland's currency is the Farland dollar. Okay, those two things that we're told. What do we know about Farland? Well, almost nothing. So we need to start applying a model like Pestel so that we can consider the political, economical, social, technological, environmental and legal factors that are in play in Farland. For example, is Farland a military dictatorship where you've got very autocratic leadership controlling imports and exports, or not? I mean, it does say it's a developed and industrialized country, so perhaps we're looking at a democracy. Okay, so does it have a strong economy? It's a developed, industrialized country. That suggests a degree of market maturity. It suggests that you've got a large middle class, affluent set of consumers, but that actually implies that the market in Farland might be somewhat saturated, and so it's important for Portafone to be able to export. And we know that it does actually do this because it says down here Portafone's a global manufacturer and its products can be purchased in most countries. Okay, so exports are very important. So that brings us right back up here to the Farland dollar currency. All right, there's some exchange rate risk here, because if Portafone is trading and paying taxes in Farland dollars, but it's actually exporting to countries that have different currencies, then there's some risk there. Are exchange rates going to fluctuate enormously, making it less profitable one month to sell to the United States than it is another month, for example? Or is it the case that Farland's currency is very strong against, for example, the US dollar, making imports from Farland less attractive to the US? You've got to consider that sort of thing. That all plays in to Farland's trade balance. And is there an opportunity, by the way, for Farland to join some kind of economic union like the European Union, or supranational body like the World Trade Organization or something? That's something to consider. What are the social factors in Farland? Well, we know that it's a developed and industrialized country. We keep coming back to this. It does imply that there's considerable sophistication among consumers. So perhaps it may be the case that Farland has significant innovations that it can export to less sophisticated nations. So we may need to start analysing it through a model like Porter's Diamond, the competitive advantage of nations. Does Farland have a competitive advantage when it comes to exporting? Does it have specialised access to inputs and innovation that the countries it's exporting to don't have, that's going to make it a more competitive company in the overseas nation? Okay, so you can see how the different models can be used in different ways to pull out information and start to analyse things, and then you can use those to make recommendations. For example, if it turns out through your Porter's Diamond analysis that you in Farland have greater access to a certain type of component or input that's going to make you more competitive, then you might be able to recommend that you enter that particular market and so forth. That's how you use the models within the exam. Now, let's have a look at the third and longest paragraph here. This is all about the history of Portafone, and we learn that it began as a company called Brinestar Electronics, and it made things like radios, okay, right back in the 1950s. That's an awful long time ago. Okay, so it's a very old and mature company. What it's done over the years is that it has pivoted and evolved in response to developments in consumer tastes and trends. And by 1995, Portafone was making nothing but mobile phones, okay, and it actually, at this stage, changed its brand to Portafone from Bridgestone. Now, this is an awfully long paragraph. Considering there's very little information here in the pre-seen, I want to have a look at why we might be being told this about the company. Okay, think back to what we looked at right at the top of this particular video when we looked at the saturated nature of the market. Okay, it's very slow growth. We've established that about 1.5% globally. All right, and it's very hard to find competitive advantage here. It's very incremental, but essentially there's very little difference between one release of an iPhone and another. And so what's actually happening in the industry, the real world industry, that might be a clue as to what might come up in the exam? Well, I think that we need to consider where Portafone might go next. Okay, that might be wearables that play into sport and health, like the Fitbit. It might be something like the Apple Watch, for example. But these are the sorts of things where manufacturers with this kind of technological know-how could expand or pivot into. So wearables is one thing. Another aspect is tablets. We haven't looked at that, but a lot of mobile phone manufacturers also manufacture tablet computers. Tablet computers, actually, if you look at the iPad and compare it to the iPhone, for example, what an iPad is basically a massive iPhone that doesn't have a phone on it. Okay, so the same technology, the same operating system, the same apps, just a bigger screen. This is a market, a product category that Portafone could easily expand into or pivot into. So those are the sorts of things we might be being encouraged to consider by this long paragraph. The idea that Portafone may face some kind of crisis where it needs to consider a pivot. What else is in that paragraph? A very important point here is the knowledge that not only did Bridgestone expand into mobile phones, but at one point it completely abandoned the other things that it was making. So has the time come for Portafone to actually forget about mobile phones and do something else completely? Is a rebranding coming? And how does that play in to their stakeholders? Can you go back now and look at your stakeholder mapping that you've done through Mendeley and think, okay, well now, how are our shareholders going to react to something like this? We know they're shareholders because Portafone is actually a public company. We know this from the pre-seen. So that is something that you may need to consider. And if you do need to consider it, well, we know now from the pre-seen that there is considerable precedent for this kind of action at Portafone. Okay, they may even have the know-how within the company still of how you jump from one market category to another, how you jump from one segment, how you jump from one brand to another. And then you need to start looking at how easy it is to exit a market, which you'll know if you've done your Porter's 5 forces analysis. All right, so the last issue that I want to touch on before I say goodbye for this particular video is the issue here where it says Portafone was quoted on the Farland Stock Exchange in 1997. So we know it's a publicly quoted company, and of course that means it's going to have extra regulations that it has to comply with. For example, it's obliged to publish its financial statements and so forth, and that will add additional cost in terms of accounting, but also in terms of auditing. All right. Now, it does mean that Portafone can raise finance via equity by issuing more shares, but of course that will dilute the value of the shares already in existence, and so then they need to look at their very important high-power stakeholders, the shareholders already in existence, and see how they would react to that. Another aspect of being a quoted company is that people can examine the way that you pay dividends. We call this the dividend signalling effect because it literally sends a signal to interested parties, stakeholders, about the health of your company. For example, if you're never paying any dividends, then it doesn't look like a very good company to invest in because you may not ever get any money back out of it. However, if it's paying all of its profit in dividends, that is not investing any money back into its research and development, and so therefore it's not going to be able to sustain competitive advantage in a market like this in an ongoing way. So those are the issues you want to be looking at if you need to consider any question around debt versus equity. Should it raise debt? Should it raise equity finance? All right. Now, the last bit of information is related to this, and it's all about this bit up here where it says Thailand requires the application of IFRS for financial reporting. And of course, that is a legal obligation. It's not optional, so it's a compliance issue, and it comes under the legal aspects of your PESTEL factors. All right, so that's it from me on this particular video. In the next video in the series, I'm going to be going much deeper into the pre-seen materials and really pulling out the meat of that for you. So I will see you then. Now, before I go, I do want to remind you that Astranti Financial Training offers a range of materials beyond what you've seen here, including the study text, the full study text, the course videos, which actually drill down chapter by chapter and really get to the nub of things. The pre-seen analysis goes a little bit deeper into things, and the industry analysis gives you the real world context so that you become an expert in your case study industry. Mock exams are available along with marking and feedback from our tutors, and then there are masterclasses which are given by experts, all of which is covered by the Astranti Pass Guarantee. So I hope you'll take a moment to check those out, and I'll see you on the next one.